Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Before I get into the review, I do want to mention that there's another giveaway coming up soon, and that is for the Moondrop Starfield IEMs. So if you want to be in the running for that giveaway, make sure you're a subscriber, leave a comment down below about something to do with this video, or maybe a product you'd like to see reviewed in the future, and that will get you in the draw. If you want to get more entries in the draw as a bonus, all you need to do is jump over to the Patreon page and have a think about joining one of the tiers there. It's all explained how many extra entries you get per tier. So if that's something you're interested in, it's a great way to increase your chances of winning free gear from me. Now, interestingly enough, I'm not reviewing the Moondrop Starfield IEM today, but I am reviewing something that's somewhat of a competitor for it, and that's the Shosi Form 1.4 IEM. So this is a universal IEM. It retails at about $199 US, and it's a hybrid style IEM using a combination of dynamic and balanced armature drivers. I just want to take a couple of seconds to say that a couple of retailers and manufacturers have recently reached out to see if I'd be interested in reviewing their products. The answer is almost always a resounding yes. So if you are in the industry and you're looking to have your products reviewed here on the channel, do reach out to me either through the comments or through the email address that you can find in the About section of the YouTube channel. With that out of the way, let's start talking about the Shosi Form 1.4 IEM. When you get the Shosis, they come in a very simple cardboard box, which contains this not quite patent leather, but slightly shiny patent leather case, or at least it's a pseudo leather case. And it kind of reminds me of my school shoes. And I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. Not that I've got any bad thoughts about school, but the thought that I have with it, it's quite soft and it's also quite shiny. And I'm less inclined to want to chuck this in my bag because I feel like it's not going to show marks well. Now looking at it, I can see that it has got some different marks and bumps and bruises on it, but I'm more comfortable with something like the Campfire audio cases that look like they're going to wear really well over time. This looks to me like it's going to look a bit shabby in the same way that school shoes did when they got scuffed and a bit beaten around. So that's just a really minor point. I don't buy earphones, I don't choose earphones based on their cases, but for those of you that do care about that sort of thing, I did just want to mention it quickly. Inside the case, we've got some nice blue sort of felt type lining, the earphones themselves, the cable, and a bunch of ear tips. Interestingly, I want to talk about the ear tips briefly here. They are a unique set of ear tips. I've never received ear tips quite like these before, and what makes them unique is their size. So I'm not going to zoom in on them, but I'm just going to describe them to you. There's a range of foam tips which are fairly normal in size, but then there's also a mixture of silicone single and double flange tips. They're all a lot smaller than I'm used to getting. Now that's great for somebody like me because I've got relatively small ear canals, so I can use probably 2/3 of what's in this packet. For those of you with larger ears, you're likely going to want to use a different ear tip on the Shosis. So it's worth keeping that in mind as well. Chances are if you're buying these, they may not be your first ever IEM. You've probably got tips floating around. And it's also really easy to pick up other tips like the Spinfits and the JVC Spiral Dots that are both great tips, as well as all the generic ones out there. It's hard to go wrong with having a big collection. It can actually help you tune your earphones. And I'm going to talk about that in a separate video one day soon, as to the fact that your tips can change the sound of your earphones. For now though, I just want to mention that this is a really unique set of tips. And I love the fact that there's nice small double flange, so you can get a little bit of a deep insert without burrowing all the way into your brain like some of those really long pointy double and triple flanges can do. So putting that away, let's talk more about the earphones themselves. The cable of the earphones, first and foremost, is a really nice, like a twisted braid with a cloth sheath. It's got nice finished plugs. It's got a really nice solid metal and carbon fiber detailed, I'm assuming fake carbon fiber detailed Y-splitter here. With a little sliding cinch. So everything you need is there. It doesn't feel like the most expensive cable ever, but it feels like a really nice cable in terms of it doesn't tangle easily, it feels nice to touch, and it feels well put together and sturdy. So when I say it doesn't feel like the most expensive cable ever, that's not a knock. It's just saying it doesn't feel like you're getting a cable that's worth more than the earphones. It just feels like a really good quality cable at the level of $199 earphone. There's a little tiny bit of memory built into the heat shrink on the cable, but there's no wire as such, so it's very easy to get this comfortable and a good fit. The connectors are a 2-pin connector. It's a flush fitting on the earphone itself, and there's a slight little bit of the plastic exposed at the junction between the actual plugs and the ear tip, and that allows you to see the red and the black left and right markings. All in all, I think it's a really nice, subtle way of doing it. It makes it very easy to find your left and right in a hurry in terms of the cable ends, and it does actually make it basically a flush connection. Whereas a lot of earphones, you tend to get a bit of extra exposed plastic between the earphone and the body of the plug on the cable. So I like the cable. I think it's a really solid offering for this level of earphone, and really nothing to complain about. Obviously, being a 2-pin standard sort of connection, you can upgrade this very easily, and that's a bonus as well. Now onto the earpieces themselves. These could be one of the best made universal pseudo custom style earphones I've come across. And I say that because they are basically seamless. Shozi have used a real wood grain finish in each of the faceplates, so every single unit is slightly different. If you buy a pair of these, they will not look the same as mine. They'll have the same dark general overall look, but the actual wood grain that you'll see in the Glamour video shortly, the wood grain itself will be different depending on the piece of timber that's been used in yours. What's really nice though is it's this beautiful black shell that's basically opaque. It has a nice little piece of detail on the front. It's got the gold Shozi emblem inside the acrylic, and it's got a silver vent port on the back because this is a dynamic driver unit. And it's all seamless, it's smooth, it's solid. It actually reminds me a lot of the Fit Ear To Go's, or any of the Fit Ear models for that matter, in the fact that it's really solid, dark acrylic, beautifully polished, beautifully finished. It's not quite on the level of the Fit Ears, but it is extremely close. And for an IEM at $200 odd, that's saying something. They're beautifully, beautifully made.
Let your body take control. You're on my mind, baby. Just move a little closer. And I say, oh.
So that's about all there is to talk about in terms of the design and the accessories that come with these. It's just the tips, the case, the cable, and the earpieces themselves. So it's a really good package. Starting at that level before you stick them in your ears, you're already almost ahead. Obviously they need to sound good, but in terms of the fit and finish and the accessorizing, they're a really good offering at that $199 US mark. So all they need to do now is sound great. And let's talk a bit about that. The sound from these I would describe overall as warm, but what really took me by surprise was the presentation quality from these. Now I should mention at this point, I am using the JVC spiral dot tips on these. I played around with the supplied ones. and they all were fine, but out of curiosity, I chucked on a pair of the spiral dots and it just added a little bit of extra something to the sound. So that's been what I've stuck with. The comments I'm going to make about the sound are not drastically varied by the fact that I'm using the spiral dots. So don't think that it's going to be night and day. Tips do make a slight difference to the sound, but it is slight. And just as me going from the stock tips to the spiral dots improved them for my ears, you may actually find the same sort of improvement comes from the stock tips compared to the spiral dots for your ears because of the biology and the shape and the length, etc. of our ear canals. We're all a little bit different. So what I'm going to say is going to be close enough to true regardless of the tip that I'm using. All of my listing's been done with a combination of devices, including the Pioneer XDP 300R digital audio player. I've also used the recently reviewed and hugely overkill for driving an IEM like this, Sparco's Labs Aries amplifier, as well as the THX AAA 789 amplifier from Massdrop or Drop. And in the case of the two separate amplifiers, they were being driven by the Chord Cutest. So I've driven some pretty high quality sources into this, and indeed all of the IEMs I'm going to talk about in comparison for this review, and the quality regardless of what I plugged these into was outstanding. Overall, I'd say they're not particularly source dependent. They're going to reveal a little bit of the source, but they're not going to change drastically from one source to the next. What I found I really enjoyed about the 1.4s was that they're just marvelously smooth. Now that doesn't mean that they're thick or lacking in detail or extension, but they are a warmer, richer sounding earphone. So those of you that like clean analytical sounds, these aren't going to be for you, But those of you that like to get lost in the music and kick back and relax and really go with the enjoyment of an earphone, these are going to be a fantastic option to consider. I did find there was a tiny little bit of upper mid glare on certain tracks, and indeed, as I went between certain devices, I do think, depending on the device, I heard a little bit more, a little bit less of that. So it is something to be aware of. They can have a little tiny bit of upper mid glare, and that just hits you on certain vocals where it gets a little bit edgy or a little bit dry sounding in that upper mid. But it's not common, and it's really just with certain recordings. And in many cases, most IEMs, unless they're absolutely masterfully tuned, most IEMs are going to have little tiny peaks and troughs in the sound signature that is going to create those little areas of negative synergy, if you like, where it just doesn't match up well with a particular piece of recording and mastering. What that upper mid accentuation does do though, is it provides for an excellent sense of micro details and texture throughout the mid-range of the presentation. And I believe it's possibly also the secret sauce that makes the presentation of the Form 1.4 so good. And I cannot stress enough how good that presentation is. I put these on one evening when I was doing some of my early listening, and I was playing Craig Armstrong's The Space Between Us album, particularly the track This Love, which has got vocals by Elizabeth Fraser from the Cocteau Twins. As I listened to that, it was so clear to me the space where Elizabeth Fraser was standing dead center in front of me, and then the orchestra and all of the other instruments were in this beautiful, perfect circle around the central vocal. It was really quite amazing to listen to. I've gone on and listened to that same piece of music on a couple of other pieces of equipment to see if they can reproduce it the same way. And I have to say, nothing's quite approached the level of perfection between, and there's a synergy going on here between the 1.4s and that particular piece of mastering. Now that's a really well produced album. So what it tells me is that the Form 1.4s are reproducing good recordings really nicely. Admittedly, not every track reaches that same level of perfection with these. There's obviously just a nice synergy there, but at the same time, I do find that they are consistently presenting the music in a beautiful holographic way. The vocals or the central instrumentals are quite close and quite intimate, but then everything else seems to stretch out in the background. Funnily enough, over the years, I've owned a few different pieces of Shozi equipment, including the original Alien audio player and some of their spin-off portable USB type DAC amplifier devices. And every time what I found was that Shozis did something with the presentation of the sound that was always really enjoyable. When it came to things like the player and the DAC, I didn't always lean towards those as a perfect solution because I wanted the source to be a bit more pure. But when it comes to an earphone doing it, I love the fact that that same attention to presentation and space and soundstage size has been applied here, because it means you can put a beautiful source in there and then get that soundstage enhancement from the actual earphones themselves. So on that point, I think Shozi have absolutely nailed it in terms of that presentation ability. The sound signature is going to be a mixed bag for some people. It is going to be a little bit too thick for some. It's going to lack a little bit of treble extension for some, and some may have a very, very slight issue with that little bit of upper mid dryness. But for me, they're an earphone I would absolutely recommend to anyone that enjoys a musical sound. They're not, I don't think, a bass head earphone. I don't feel like they're pounding and thumping. They've got really good bass response, but it's not a point of emphasis. To me, they're more of a gentle sloping type signature where the bass down through the mids are a little bit enhanced. There's probably a bit of a bump in the mids, and then it tapers off into the treble. The treble extension's still there, but it's at a lesser level of energy compared to the rest of the signature. To help put this into perspective, I wanted to actually share some direct comparisons with some other earphones that you might already know, or that I've reviewed before that you might have familiarity with from the channel. So I'm going to start with the Shure SE215s. These have been around forever. They're a single dynamic driver model, and that lends a sense of coherency in a lot of cases. A single driver can often give you a much more coherent sound, and so that's where the 215s potentially can outdo something like the Form 1.4s that are using a single dynamic driver mixed with 4 balanced armatures. So overall, it's actually a 3-way setup, and that can sometimes cause problems with coherency. So there was a chance the 215s would have an edge. Now the 215s retail currently at about $79 US. I'm not sure if that's a special it's on at the moment, but even so, there's quite a big difference. We're talking more than double the price of the 1.4s. So I was curious to see how they performed. What I found was the 215s actually further enhance that dryness in the mids, and that's always been my slight complaint with these. They're they're quite a nasal sounding earphone, and until you get used to that sound signature, they can be a little bit off-putting, I find. That said, I think they do balance the mids a bit better. I think there's a little bit of peakiness in the upper mids from the 1.4s that the Shures smooth out a bit more. So overall, whilst I think the upper mid energy level is higher from the 215s, it's more of a smoother, consistent sound. Maybe from your sort of your mid-range, it bounces up slowly and then comes back down again. Whereas with the 1.4, I felt like it was maybe a little bit peaky like that, and that's where certain recordings hit those little peaks and it gets a little bit jarring. It's very slight, but it's there. Ultimately, what I found with the 215 was that overall they're actually quite similar in terms of the quality of the image, the sense of the soundstage space is both very good, but the Form 1.4s delivered that presentation, that musicality, and that overall enjoyment to a greater degree. What surprised me was that they actually also provided a better sense of micro detail and textures than the 215s. So that's where those balanced armatures are probably coming into play. The level of subtle detail retrieval that balanced armatures sometimes can do better than a dynamic driver. So moving on from the Shures, let's take one more step up now, and we're going to talk about the Moondrop Starfield IEMs. Now these have arrived just recently from Shenzhen Audio, so thank you to the team at Shenzhen for sending them out. They will be reviewed soon, and they are the earphone in the next giveaway. So if you want to win these, A, make sure you watch out for the review, and B, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment so you're in the running. Or even better, join the Patreon page and you'll get extra bonus entries. The Starfields are another single dynamic driver IEM, so they're similar to the Shures in that regard, but they're about $30 more than the Shures. So they step up now to $109 US. So we're still just over half the price of the Form 1.4s, but we're talking in vaguely a similar range. In that $100 to $200 range, you can pick both of these up. Now what I found was that the Starfield is probably a more balanced signature overall. It's got a little bit less bass, a little bit more treble, and for some people it's going to come across as more realistic and more accurate because it is a little bit more neutral. That said, the presentation is a lot flatter. There's a good sense of space left to right, but it just doesn't give you that sense of depth that the Form 1.4s do so well. So it's a bit of a trade-off. It all comes down to whether you prefer the presentation or whether you prefer the more neutral sound signature. I do think the Starfield, and I haven't thought about them in isolation as much yet, but I do think they're probably on the warm side of neutral, but they're closer to neutral than the 1.4s, which are quite lush and quite musical. Both do have really good strong bass, with it obviously being balanced with a bit more treble in the Starfields, but I think the quality and quantity of bass in the Shozzies is just a tiny hair ahead of the Starfields. So all in all, they're both actually really compelling arguments in that price category. I would still lean towards the 1.4, but it's only because I value that presentation, that sense of space and size in the soundstage so much, whereas others will actually prefer the Starfield and its more neutral presentation. So finally, let's move on to my previous champion in the budget, sort of sub $200 earphone. I guess you could call all three of these the Starfield, the 1.4s, and now these you could call Chi-Fi products if you like. And the final one here is the SIMGOT EN700 Pro. I reviewed this some time ago and I love it. It's still one of my go-to earphones. Even though I've got more expensive earphones, it just does so much very well. Again, it's a single dynamic driver earphone as opposed to the hybrid offering we've got here in the 1.4s. When I just checked recently, the EN700 Pros can be had for about $180 US, so we're talking really comparable pricing here between the two. In terms of the presentation, what I found was the EN700 Pro has a lighter, more delicate sound. It's definitely got more treble energy and probably a more balanced signature overall for those looking for a more neutral approach. However, it's still got excellent bass, so it's not truly neutral as some people like to think in terms of rule of flat. It's got that bass lift as well to keep it dynamic and engaging and fun. It's not as relaxing a listen as the 1.4s. So the 1.4s I could put in my ears, close my eyes and just drift off into the music. Whereas with the 700s, I do find that I get broken out of that reverie occasionally because of that extra bit of detail and clarity and treble energy that comes out of the earphones. So it all depends on what your tastes are. I tend to be a little bit treble sensitive, so I will always tend to lean towards a slightly more musical and warmer sound, whereas others will actually prefer the 700s in this case. I think both of them you really can't go wrong, and it comes down to what your preference is in terms of sound signature. Interestingly, after having the 700 Pros on for a few minutes and then coming back to their Shozzies, the Shozzies started to sound a bit thick and a bit warm, a bit too warm. Having said that, in isolation, I do prefer these. So if you're A-Bing earphones, obviously it's very easy to get tricked by the contrast between one earphone and the next. So a warm earphone will make a less warm earphone sound a bit sterile at first until you adjust to it. And then you go back in the other direction and all of a sudden that warmer earphone sounds thick and heavy. So there was enough contrast between the 700s and the 1.4s that effect happened. However, I didn't find that effect happening as much with the Starfields or the Shure 215s. So that tells me that the 215s and the Moondrop are closer to the 1.4s, whereas the SIMGOTs are a little bit more removed. They're much more of an overall balanced earphone. They're more of a balanced earphone than something like the Starfields when we're comparing them to the 1.4s. So where does all this leave us? For me, I bought these with my own money. They weren't a review sample, and I absolutely intend to keep these. I do often buy gear like the Obasso DC01 and DC02. I buy it, I give it away after the review because I don't need it. With the 1.4s, I'm absolutely keeping them because I thoroughly enjoy them. They're probably going to bump the EN700 Pros off their perch of being my kind of go-to budget earphone, but at the same time, I do still love the EN700 Pros. It's not knocking those. The 1.4s just do some really magical stuff with that presentation. So I guess how I'd summarize is if you are someone who is looking for a beautifully made universal earphone that actually looks like a custom earphone, and on top of that, you really enjoy great soundstage and a warm musical signature that you can absolutely just lose yourself in without sacrificing detail. So I can't stress enough, whilst these are not bright and sparkly in the treble, I felt like I was getting plenty of micro details, particularly in the mid-range and the textures of the instruments. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, if you like the presentation, you like the musicality of an earphone, these are absolutely worth looking out for. They're available lots of places. I'll put a link down below, which will go through to the affiliate links through Amazon. That's one option, but I've also seen them on Shenzhen and a number of other places. So if that sounds like you, jump through one of the links below, grab yourself a pair, and I think you'll be really happy with what you hear. There's something special going on in the 1.4s that's pretty unique compared to a lot of the earphones I've heard. Now I've got some great content coming up in the next few weeks with some headphone reviews. I've got the Moondrop Starfields that I've already mentioned, the Topping E30 DAC. So some great content coming down the pipeline. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're interested in those. And of course, if you also drop a comment down below, you'll immediately be in the running to win the Moondrop Starfields once the review's all done. Until then though, happy listening, stay safe, stay well, and I look forward to seeing you here next time on Passion for Sound.